Great. Thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you, Cynthia, for making the perfect presentation and setting the ground for me and for my presentation. So the paper I will be presented today is just a slice of my PhD thesis, and I'm working on citizenship practices of IDPs in Ukraine. And today I will be presenting you some of the more visual material that is not included in the paper. It's discussed in the paper, but not included. So it's just like a welcome for you to go and read the paper if you are interested in, of course. So my research is ethnographic, and I was doing a couple of months of research with the IDP hub in Kyiv in 2015-2016. And during my time, I've seen a lot of instances that IDPs were calling themselves homeless, and in particular, they were calling themselves in Russian it's bomzhi, or we can say it, homeless people. And I was wondering what is happening. Why did they call themselves homeless? It's not because there was something that is not only about the lack of housing, but something deeper. So to give you a bit more introduction, so there is approximately 1.4, 1.7 million registered IDPs, depending on how the conflict was fluctuating since the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of the military conflict in Donbass. So Ukrainian state is facing a huge challenge in how to help the IDPs. And in particular, there is a problem of housing, as reported from the June 2020 by the IOM monitoring that Cynthia just mentioned. Only 11% of IDPs are living in their own accommodation. So a lot of displaced people left the non-government controlled areas of Donbass to remain in their homeland, Ukraine. But on the other hand, majority of them at the same time lost access to their own property in the non-governmental controlled areas, effectively making them homeless in their own country. As a result, IDPs have an aberrant status. They are citizens, but they are in a refugee-like situation. So what is home? Why is home important? Home gets quite a lot of attention in migration studies. And because we are talking about forced migration of IDPs, home is often associated in literature with such attributes as familiarity, security, stability, freedom, privacy. And there is also a very important element of it is emotional dimension of feeling at home. So as my theoretical framework for this particular paper, I'm basing my analysis on the distinction between a small and a big home made by the Danish anthropologist Anders Stefansson. He was taking the example of Bosnia, especially the Bosnians who returned to their dwellings that they had to leave because of the war. And they restored their property rights. They were giving back their dwellings. But when they came back, they discovered that the wider social context in Bosnia changed so much that they actually could not could not live there anymore, and majority of them left for the second time. So they've seen that their ethnic composition of the population, the urbanization, the everyday relationship changed so much that this small home to which they came back to their houses didn't give them this feeling of being at home, because the wider social context, what Stefansson calls big home, changed so much. And this discrepancy between apparent desire to come back to old dwelling as an ideal solution to the displacement and the actual situation on the ground in the wider social milieu demonstrates that such anticipated homecomings are impossible for a lot of displaced people. So how I'm using it in the case of Ukrainian IDPs, I slightly modified this distinction between a small and a big home that Stefansson made. And for me, the small home is exactly the properties, the dwellings, the allotments, houses of IDPs in the non-government controlled areas that they had to leave. And the big home is Ukrainian institutional framework, Ukrainian legal order. So now in the occupied areas of Donbass, Ukrainian home is absent. And the absence of this Ukrainian big home was one of the reasons that why a lot of people left the now occupied areas of Donbass. And Cynthia just mentioned that especially this random nature of violence which is actually the antipode of being at home, because at home you feel safe and stable, and this random violence pushed people to resettle to other regions of Ukraine. So my aim in the paper is to show how the displaced Ukrainians link this small home and the big home, institutional home. And I argue that IDPs claim that they have lost and left their homes in Donbass, their dwellings and properties, in order to remain within the institutional home in Ukraine. And this is just a poster that shows that actually encompasses this dilemma. They left their home, their houses, in order to remain home in Ukraine. And this argument helps IDPs to claim being rightfully at home in Ukraine and demand state support in providing alternative housing. So as we see this, because IDPs left their small homes, they in fact felt that they now are homeless in their own country. And this feeling of homelessness has two meanings. And I will give you an example. And I'm quoting from one of the young IDPs from Donetsk. I became homeless, no belongings, no house, no job, no chance to see my family. The first time, these were Russian bandits that took our home. The second time, it was our state that took our hope to return home. So these words of this young IDP reflect the anger towards the Ukrainian state, which, first of all, did not protect people in the Donbass when the conflict was starting. And then it didn't give them this feeling of stability, of security, and that's why they have to leave. On the other hand, they're not also feeling completely at home in Ukraine after the displacement, because they don't have where to live. There is this huge problem of housing, and they don't feel supported by the state after displacement. And this widespread feeling of homelessness was quite paramount among my research participants. But on the other hand, this loss of home mobilized a lot of people to political actions. And I just want to give you two examples. So this first example is the flash mob organized in February 2016 in front of the Parliament of Ukraine, when the first parliamentary hearings about the IDP situation were taking place. And you see that people were gathering with self-made posters, and then the first poster that you've seen also, Ukraine is our country, Ukraine is our common home, why did I become homeless? Million people not at home. And IDPs are actually claiming that Ukraine is their big institutional home, and asking why, if we chose Ukrainian institutional home, why are we homeless now? And IDPs in this particular case demanded the members of the parliament and the wider public to pay attention to the pressing issue of housing. And these posters reflect that for many IDPs, Ukraine as a common homeland entailed more than just a feeling of being at home, but also a very real expectation about the state's obligations to fulfill its rights towards its citizens, and to the protection of their properties, and to to provide them feeling at home after displacement by providing accommodation, or at least access to the subsidized accommodation. It's interesting, what was the effect of this loss of property, loss of the small home for the IDPs among the people that were my participants? So, and the research shows that, interestingly, the loss of small home actually reinforced the feeling that Ukraine is their big homeland, that it was worth leaving their small homes to remain in a big Ukrainian home. So, for example, FASS and Lackner documented that as a result of these events, 2013, 2016, the war and displacement and Euromaidan, a third, like 35, 36% of IDPs felt more Ukrainian, and they felt more like Ukrainian citizens. So the notion of home gained a wider perspective and encompasses now the national level for the IDPs. Ukraine as a national home is increasingly relevant for IDPs, as it allows them to reconcile their abandoned places of origin, now in occupied areas, and the current residents through the increased attachment to citizenship and to feeling of Ukraine being their homeland. On the other hand, what is happening also, that the loss of this small home, their possessions and their dwellings in the now occupied areas of Donbass, made them literally homeless. But this also pushed a lot of people to fight for their housing rights with the Ukrainian institutional home. And if you read the paper, you will see there are cases when IDPs were suing Ukrainian state, going as far as to the European Court of Human Rights. And the second example shows how the IDPs were advocating for their housing rights. For example, in September 2017, one of the IDPs, Yulia Ilyashenko, she was the head of NGO Mojdom UA. She began a hunger strike in front of the government of Ukraine to raise attention to the housing problems of IDPs. She was joined by others and they were protesting against the state postponing passing of the law that would give IDPs access to the state subsidized programs. The hunger strike didn't result in any, it was not successful. It lasted for 4 days, but IDPs, mostly women, didn't give up, and they organized, they changed the format of the protest. And then the pictures that you see here is how they changed the protest. So they decided to domesticate the public space in front of the government building by organizing so-called party in the house, Вечеринка на дому. So they were wearing their home clothes, their guns and sleepers, they were lying on their camp coats, and they were trying to bring attention of the governmental officials and of the wider public to the continuous struggle in establishing homes after resettlement. And you see, yeah, thank you. And they were trying to show that Ukraine is their home and they want to be in Ukraine and to live in Ukraine. And it's noteworthy that this stage appropriation of public space was making by women, and this feminine domestic space was recreated with the use of personal attributes like home clothes, accessories, to make political claims of recognitions as Ukrainians and as owners of property. So in this case, protesters indicated that governmental political plans are preventing them from realizing their dreams of having a house and feeling at home in Ukraine. In the end, what happened, that protests did result in the government passing the necessary decrees, although the finding was deferred to up 1 year further. It was only given in October 2018. And this is how the IDPs became part of the state subsidized programs. But unfortunately, the access to these state subsidized programs.
My apologies, we have to conclude. Just one more sentence on the conclusion, please.
Yes. So the most vulnerable IDPs, that such as pensioners, people with disabilities, unemployed, or people with other traumas, they had predominated to return to live in the non-governmental controlled areas. That's why we have this huge discrepancy between the number of registered IDPs and the number of those IDPs that are considered to be living, in fact, in the non-government controlled areas. To conclude, for IDPs, the small and the big homes are closely linked. IDPs left small homes in Donbass to remain at home in Ukraine, but many became literally and emotionally homeless with little support from the Ukrainian state. Thank you. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Lydia.